Okay, so good evening, ladies, gentlemen, and those who are watching this back after hours. Welcome to our latest webinar. Tonight we're going to be talking about combat cohesion, why and how soldiers fight, the factors that affect that, the implications for Western military forces and the future of warfare, and also looking into some of the contemporary examples from Ukraine. Just a reminder before I kick this off and hand over to our guest speaker to keep your microphones on mute. If you have questions at any point, you're welcome to put them into the chat. We will be holding questions to a logical point and mostly at the end. This webinar is scheduled for 90 minutes, which will look around about 45 to 1 hour of presentation and then 30 minutes plus for questions. So introducing our guest speaker, so Professor Anthony King has taken time out from his very busy schedule to speak to us this evening. He has a much bigger bio than you're seeing on the screen here. A couple of his books that he's written are on the right-hand side. Anthony, I'll just give you the privilege of reading out your bio that you sent to me just before this. So Anthony King is the chair of war studies at the University of Warwick. In 2019, he finished a trilogy on military transformation in the 21st century, the transformation of Europe's armed forces, the combat soldier, which pertains to tonight's presentation, and command. His latest book, Urban Warfare in the 21st Century, was published by Polity Press in July 2021, and he currently holds, and apologies if I murdered the enunciation here, that the Leverhulme Major Research Fellowship, and is researching into the effects of disruptive technologies and urban operations. He's advised the British Army and Royal Marines since 2004, which has included several high-profile reports. Most recently, in 2022, he was commissioned to write a report on the British Army following the Atherton report called "To Fight and Win: An Audit of British Army Culture." So I have done exactly what you said not to there, Anthony, just to read out the whole thing.
That's all right. I didn't want to put you under any pressure. It's okay.
No worries. In summary, Anthony is more than capable of talking on a number of topics, but we have pinioned him to the cohesion webinar, which builds upon a previous webinar we did on tactical psychology. But if you do, at the very end, if you do want to quiz him on urban warfare or command, you are more than welcome to, and maybe in the future we can get him back on those thoughts, and certainly on the culture would be another fascinating discussion. But without further ado, Anthony, the floor is yours. I will drive the slides as
okay. That's great, because I'm totally incompetent at doing, and what we've got to do is get off this slide with this photo that makes me look like I'm a crazy person on it. So we want to move on to the slides pretty quickly. Oh, and you've made them look very professional, so that's even better. Well done. So look, yeah, so I'll talk, I think, for about 45 minutes. I think in this format, much more than that is not optimal. So let me start talking now. And so, yeah, I mean, the topic I'd like to talk to is this issue of small unit cohesion, small unit combat performance, tactical combat performance. And I'd like to essentially give a speech in kind of two halves, one about, well, three thirds. First, a little bit an introduction, a theoretical introduction, and then a discussion of cohesion in a mass citizen army, in the small units of a mass citizen army, so an infantry platoon in a mass citizen army, and then a look at how that has changed. Although many people fail to, presume it's all one, I would argue that actually there's quite a big difference between the two, even though there's continuities in terms of tactics. So three parts, and I think about 45 minutes, and then we can talk about anything we want to talk about. It would be great. So look, problem of combat. Let's look at this book by S.L.A. Marshall. S.L.A. Marshall is a famous, controversial figure, and I'm sure that many of you are very, very familiar with many of his works. And he was commissioned into the US Army about 1916-17, and he did actually go to France in 1918, but he never actually served in combat. And he subsequently held a regular commission. But in the Second World War, he became, although he continued with that commission, and indeed was eventually promoted to brigadier general, he was a military historian and he worked on the so-called Green Book. So he was one of the writers in the official US Army history in the Second World War, along with some other people. But he was an important figure in that team that wrote up the official history. So he got amazing access to the American Army in the Second World War, and then continued having excellent access through the Korean War and in the Vietnam War. Now, I'm sure most of you read it, but in his famous 1948 book, which was based on his official work, his official history work in the Second World War, he made a very interesting and controversial argument, which I'm sure you're familiar with. That on the basis of his research, and he went round both the Pacific Theatre and the European theatre, interviewing large numbers of soldiers, normally in about company groups, to delineate, to work out what had happened on the battlefield. And on the basis of that research, he found this finding that you can see on the right hand side here, namely that, look, the myth, the image, the filmic image of warfare is, oh, the minute everyone gets into battle, they all fight, and there's never, everyone's keen to fight, and they fire the weapons and they perform and do exactly what they want. And what he notices actually, that wasn't true at all, that most people didn't do anything. In a mass citizen army, when there's a serious problem in the sense that, unlike previous forms of warfare, platoons and companies had to spread out. And of course, the minute they came into contact with the enemy, everybody lay down, because any area about a foot above the ground was potentially lethal, filled with lead and etc. So the companies and platoons spread out, and then they lay down and they're under fire. And so an incredible and almost unstoppable inertia set in, and recurrently set in to these platoons in contact from the First World War onwards, when the dispersion started to be recognized as essential if they were going to survive at all. And what he therefore found was that, against the image of everyone getting stuck in and doing their job, actually, in a US Army infantry platoon in the Second World War, hardly anyone fought at all. Hardly anyone fired their weapon. And he had this metric of saying, right, it's a low grade. If anyone fired a weapon in any way, fired one round from their rifle, threw one grenade, he counted them as a firer. And what he found is about no more than 1 in 4 infantry soldiers ever fired their weapon in combat. In other words, there was extraordinary pressures on inertia, and most soldiers did very little in combat. And indeed, he interviewed paratroopers in Normandy, and this is where actually one of the cases where he derived the evidence from. And paratroopers were certainly tough, and they'd volunteered, and so their performance definitely was normally higher than a regular infantry unit. But he found that even there, you were lucky if you get the ratio up to 25% or 30%. So even in supposedly elite units in citizen armies, there seemed to be a problem in terms of performance. Now, the question is then, how did armies in the 20th century try to overcome the inertia problem? How do they get their soldiers to actually fight in combat? And at this point, we immediately link the two topics: combat performance at the tactical level, platoon tactics and platoon performance, and cohesion, the sort of bonds between the soldiers. Let's go on to the next slide, and I'll just introduce the topic a little bit more. So, if we look at explaining the combat performance, getting over essentially the problem of inertia on a modern industrial battlefield dominated by firepower, if we look at the literature, and a lot of it does derive out of the problem that Marshall noted. Now, in a footnote, and we could talk about this in questions afterwards, there's loads of controversy about Marshall. He was definitely a complete self-promotionist, and his evidence wasn't nearly as good as he said it was. But my basic position on Marshall is he was essentially right. His methods were horrible, but actually deep down he was essentially right. Anyway, he posed this, and more to the point, he posed this really important question. Look, actually the reality of combat is a lot different than a training exercise. In a training exercise, everyone's showing off, trying to get their special report to their officer, and there's nobody going to get hurt or killed. On a real battlefield, there's a problem of inertia. So the question then became in the literature is, right, okay, how do we get over this problem of inertia? How do you get combat troops in infantry platoons in particular, where the problem is most extreme? It's not so extreme in the armored corps. How do you get people to fight? Well, 4 explanations have been proffered from, the debate really started after the Second World War. And since the Second World War, so, 80 years ago, there's 4 basic lines of argument. One, the primary group. So soldiers will fight, they will fire their weapons, they will actually engage the enemy in close quarters if there are tight bonds in the primary group. So if platoons and squads, sections, and potentially companies, the soldiers know each other intimately and are bonded through informal social relations, they'll fight for each other. Second one is training, obviously. Training will create skills in combat which will encourage people to fight and make them capable of fighting. The third argument that you find in the literature is political motivation. And this became very important from the 1970s when people basically started to debunk various sociological accounts of combat performance. The idea here is, look, somewhere it matters to soldiers on the front line what they're fighting for. And if they can't see a point of what they're fighting for, they won't fight and they won't risk themselves. So even if they don't really state it, political motivation is important. And then the fourth one, which is hideously under-recognized. I mean, I won't talk about it too much today, but hideously under-emphasized, but actually is really important, is discipline. And this image of discipline is, I mean something by discipline, something slightly more bleak, which is, there's pretty good evidence, I'm afraid, that if people have punishments for not performing combat, which are in the future, i.e., like the Allies, you're going to be arrested and charged by a court-martial, and there's an outside possibility you might be shot in 6 months' time. Makes no difference. Yeah. But if you've got police battalions behind you, as the Italians did in the First World War, and of course the Nazis did and the Soviets did, who are going to shoot you if you don't fight right now, or they're going to put you in penal battalions immediately if you don't perform according to plan, then what I would suggest is that does concentrate the mind. And although it's a really illiberal thing to say, and no one would want to fight in an army like that, extreme forms of coercion, I think, have evidence. There is evidence that they do actually make people fight, but the coercion's got to be right up front to work. Let's go on to the next. So there's four basic ideas, 4 basic positions in terms of what explains small units overcoming the inertia that Marshall talked about. Let's go on, Ed. Let's go on to the next slide, if that's okay. So let's just go back to the Second World War. Now, after the Second World War, about the same time, in fact, exactly the same year, 1948, that Marshall published his work, there was an extremely famous article, and you can see it here. Ed's done a great job in making my slides vaguely professional. Edward Shils and Shils Janowitz, both of whom became very eminent sociologists in the US. But during the war, they're military intelligence officers, and their job towards the end was to debrief and interrogate German/Nazi prisoners to work out whether these certain soldiers and certain officers needed denazification. I mean, that was their role in Germany towards the end and after the end of the war. And out of that work, what they came to was the first serious academic articulation of the primary group thesis. And what they essentially argued, and it's a striking argument given that, you can see it in this lovely picture to the left. I mean, given the nature of the Wehrmacht and the SS forces, which is, politically rabid fanatics, basically, committing genocide left, right, and center all over Europe and wherever they went. they made a brave argument. And the brave argument was this, is what was important to the Germans was not, to the average German soldier, was not political ideology. It was not the love of Hitler, etc. It was essentially the love and affection of their fellow squad, section, platoon, company members. That essentially what explained the resilience of the German army. And remember, you know, the extraordinary difficulties the army faced. I mean, this is how Shils and Janowitz started the article, that you got this extraordinary fact that from 1942, basically the German army is losing and losing terribly, and yet it fights to basically the 6th of May, 1945. It absolutely fights to death. It's a striking thing. How does it do it? Well, Janowitz and Shils' argument was that it's not about National Socialism. It's not political ideology. We've got to look in the microdynamics of the actual small units, the companies and the platoons in the German army, and that these were bonded around a honorable concept of masculinity. The men in those platoons didn't want to let each other down, and so therefore they fought and died for each other with essentially kind of happily did so. Ed, let's go on to the next slide, which I think we might, if it's what I think it is, we might just, I've sort of made the point, but it's just a little bit more evidence. Yeah, so okay, that's that. So you can see on the left is another quote, another important quote from Janowitz and Shils. But look, in the 1970s and then in the 80s with Omar Bertov, there's a real reaction to this. And what they essentially, what Omar Bertov argues in this book, it's a really good book. I mean, I kind of fundamentally disagree with it, but it's a really good book. What he argues in this book, Hitler's Army, and in a very well received article, it's a very good article actually, is that, look, let's get real about this. You've got a bunch of crazy Nazis who since 1933 have been, you know, under this project of Aryanization. It's absolutely insane to think that they're just mates on a sort of military trip. I mean, they're sort of extraordinary sort of crusaders, totally dominated by an extreme political ideology. And his point is this: is look, you can't explain the military performance by reference to small groups, because the casualty rates from 1942 are so high. Small groups don't pertain in the operating theatre. They just get attrited all the time, and therefore, instead of stable male groups of soldiers united in intense bonds of friendship and comradeship, Omar Bertov argues that, look, it's about political ideology, because what you're doing is slotting individuals in to groups, to platoons and companies at such a regular basis that the only thing that holds them together is political ideology. I won't give my sort of various criticisms of this position, but what I would say, you know, of his detail about the attrition of the primary group, but what I would say is absolutely right about the critical nature of political motivation. And let me just sort of here try and sort of bring this sort of this kind of analysis of cohesion and small unit performance in the 20th century to a little bit of a conclusion. And what I'd say on the basis of this literature is this: look, Marsh is right. There is an inertia problem. There's a problem on an industrial battlefield getting citizen soldiers to fight. Why? In most of the cases, they've been conscripted. Their motivation levels, despite the myth, even the Second World War, their motivation levels were definitely questionable most of the time when the actual fighting started. Totally reasonably. I'm a civilian. I would be completely more than the same, being pretty reluctant to get my head blown off a cause I'm not entirely sure about. So there is a real problem. Citizen armies struggle to motivate the troops. And of course, the thing here is they don't have resources that professional armies would have later on in the later 20th century and early 21st. Namely, they're producing mass armies very quickly. So the training generally is really rudimentary and sometimes completely non-existent. So you've got rudimentarily trained soldiers and platoons going into lethal zones where their training is definitely, their skill at arms, both individually and collectively, is despite the myths of the greatest generation, is generally really quite weak. Well, what do armies try and do? Well, the organizational solution to the problem of inertia was absolutely emphasizing small unit cohesion, primary group solidarities. The bonds between soldiers as friends was deliberately emphasized by armies. Often the issue of the reference of masculinity, masculine honor became a central part of that, and not being a coward but being a proper man became a central part of that. And simultaneously, they also indoctrinated their soldiers politically. And of course, the Axis powers, Japan and Germany, were very advanced in this, but the Allied powers actually massively indoctrinated their troops in terms of politically. Now, in a footnote here, we can talk about this later. A lot of this indoctrination in the 20th century, it's an unpleasant fact, but a real fact. A lot of this indoctrination, political indoctrination, was on a racist, ethno-political basis. That, you know, essentially, and it's very pronounced in the US. It's more pronounced in the US than in Britain and the French armies, though it's also in the British and the French armies at the time, British Commonwealth armies and the French armies. You know, race, whiteness. In fact, I'm not in any way a radical race theorist, but the ethnic unity, the racial unity of the army, being white citizens, was actually really important as a symbol of political motivation. So what I'd suggest is this: we see a real problem which armies knew about, and there's huge levels of discussion about it. And since, except for elite units, which got better levels of training and were sometimes capable of executing complicated dispersed platoon drills, most of the other units were held together by these mutually supporting bonds of primary group loyalty and political motivation. And so it gave a distinctive pattern to small unit cohesion, and in fact to combat performance, because what you find, interestingly, in the mass citizen army of the 20th century is that essentially what used to happen when a platoon came into contact, when a company or platoon came into contact, I mean, cohesion for me it can never be more than about 100 people, and platoon is a good size for cohesion. It's everybody needs to know everybody. That's when we're talking about cohesion. What used to happen in the 20th century currently is essentially a platoon would come under fire. They would go to ground, totally understandably. And essentially, in most cases, you could never get the troops up again. The NCOs and the officers could never get the troops up again. So what would happen is morally responsible designated leaders, lieutenants, sergeants, corporals, will essentially individually, virtuosically execute an action on their own. You know, they'd run forward and grenade and machine gun nest on their own. And you get this recurrent description of individuals pursuing the fight while their colleagues in the platoon basically are bystanders, kind of targets for the enemy, essentially, at best targets for the enemy, or reluctant supporters of the action. And you can see many examples of that. So Citizen Army, you get a distinctive kind of platoon tactics related to the way that the cohesion, the motivation is generated. Let's go on to the next slide, which should be 21st century, I think. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So 21st century. Let's go on to 21st century. Well, look, from the 1970s, it's early in Britain. Conscription was ended in 1960 in Britain. Last conscript left the British Army in 1963. But obviously, it's a decade later in America and in places like Australia. So you move from a mass citizen army to a smaller all-volunteer professional force. It's a really important political thing. It's a really important change in the contractual status of soldiers. What I suggest is that profound organizational change works its way down to the level of the infantry platoon itself. And essentially, the character of cohesion and the character of combat performance at the platoon level begins to change. And here's the thing that's confusing. In many cases, except when we come to sort of new urban CQB tactics, professional soldiers even today are executing drills, platoon drills that were invented in the First World War. First modern platoon drills, doctrine, 1916, sort of around the time Battle of the Somme, Battle of Verdun. That's where they came out of. Dispersed fire and maneuver drills. That's when the first French, British and German doctrine starts to develop in terms of this new approach. So those practices are there in the 20th century, and sometimes platoons are able to do it, but most often they don't. Now, what I would suggest is, as forces are professionalized, it's an organizational, contractual, civil, military change, but it's actually had really profound impacts at the micro level of the platoon in terms of the patterns of cohesion and, as I say, the way tactics are executed. Let's go on to the next slide, Ed, if that's okay. So what I'd say, one of the key things here, I'd say, is the infantry drill, the platoon drill, becomes absolutely central to all that takes place. So, as I say, in the 20th century, platoon drills have been developed. All the combatants knew well, in doctrinal terms, platoon drills. But what I'd suggest in the late 20th and early 21st century is that suddenly all volunteer militaries have the resources and they have the time and space to actually start to train their platoons in an adequate fashion. So the drills aren't just theoretical, they can actually be executed regularly and routinely by their soldiers and Marines when they are in combat. And you can see this quote from a US Marine captain that where it's sort of nice quotation. I'm not saying it's obviously it was like he was training some US Marine officers, so it may be sort of slightly more rhetorical than a soldier would like, but it usefully encapsulates the move to training as a key way of preparing soldiers and preparing platoons to solve the problem of inertia that Marshall had noted, namely the the SLA Marshall problem of battlefield inertia. Let's go on, and I'll give you just a quick example of this in terms of Afghanistan. So look, there's a really good example of this. I mean, we could think, I'm sure it's humbling to talk. I'm sure there's loads of people here who've been in firefights and have executed some of these platoon tactics. But there's a really good example of this. And it's this platoon from the 502nd Parachute Infantry in Afghanistan, in Kunar province in 2007, and the so-called Ganjgal ambush. It's a really interesting case. So it's part of an operation called Operation Rock Avalanche, where they were just trying, the American, the battalion and a slightly larger force were trying to clear a valley of which had been a Taliban stronghold. And as part of this clearance operation, one of the platoons from second platoon from 502nd were basically advancing down a sort of blunt, rocky, with some trees on it, ridge line in the Ganjgal Valley the place is Ganjgal in the Korangal Valley. The actual is the name of the valley. And anyway, it was night. There was no moon. They had no artillery support. They had no aviation support. And so it becomes quite an interesting example, because unlike most fights in Afghanistan or indeed Iraq, the Taliban versus this platoon was a pretty even fight. And indeed, it was an uneven fight because the Taliban ambushed them, and you could see it was almost a 360 ambush, but they ambushed them at night. And because there was no moon, night vision goggles didn't work. As I say, there was no aviation, there was no ability to call artillery. So it was a real sort of kind of fair fight. And what was interesting was that, you know, what you'd more normally expect, and if you were the enemy, you would hope this. If you were the ambusher, you would hope this. This would be a foregone conclusion. The Taliban ambushers will kill the whole lot of them, and that would be the end of the story. And certainly that's typically what happened in Vietnam, that conscript soldiers were typically caught in Viet Cong and NVA ambushes, and they were killed to a man very routinely because they were incapable of executing drills. But that's not what happened this night on the 25th of October. What happened was they came, this leading section came under fire, and a couple of them were hit and wounded, but the rest of the squad, the section, basically took cover where they were, and then prepped their grenades, threw their grenades, and then charged out of the kill zone back at the Taliban, and routed the Taliban. And Giunta himself, Salvatore Giunta, who got a Congressional Medal of Honor subsequently, sort of ran down the hillside and saw the lead, the point soldier, Sergeant Brennan, he'd been wounded, in fact mortally wounded, being carried away by a couple of Taliban. He shot the two Taliban and dragged his colleague, Sergeant Brennan, back. Well, it's a very interesting case in my view. It's not the only case, but it's an interesting case because what you see here is a disadvantaged infantry platoon, infantry squad, which really should be eliminated in a fair fight, actually executing its drills. Let's go on to the next slide. I mean, some of the interesting things is also the way they described it. So up on the right-hand side is a quote from Shils Janowitz himself. And what's interesting is the self-description of the action, which is they consciously, Shils Janowitz himself and his colleagues, even in this situation of extremists, they consciously executed an anti-ambush drill. And what was also interesting is that one of those, I mean, you will know it much better than me, but apparently, well, they prepped grenades and threw grenades because that's the drill at night, because then the enemy can't see your muzzle flashes, so they're less likely to kill you, which is, you know, to me, as a civilian, pretty sophisticated piece of tactical judgment. Anyway, the point about that I'm trying to emphasize here, and you can see I've extracted out a piece of the actual drill, the anti-ambush drill from US Army doctrine, from their army training, one of their army training pamphlets. And essentially, Junta's squad that night at the Ganjgal basically executed a drill, and they were able to prevail in this pretty unfavorable situation by the execution of a drill that had been ingrained into all of them through very intensive training. So just let's note what I'm arguing here. What I'm saying here is, look, the issues of political motivation, bonds of friendship between these soldiers, although I'll come on to talk about the bonds of friendship between them, are actually not that relevant in explaining their combat performance. Their combat performance, their sort of cohesion in tactical practice, is to be explained actually much more by training and the execution of drills, the inculcation of established infantry drills. Let's go on to the next slide, yeah. So and this is kind of the last theoretical point I want to make about 21st century cohesion and combat. And then I'll come to a kind of conclusion. So what I would suggest is, if we see a shift from a tactical performance, platoon level performance based on motivation and political motivation and personal loyalty, which generates individual virtuosity, a lieutenant who runs forward and takes out positions, etc., because nobody else is going to do it, and that's that lieutenant's responsibility, to a force in which the execution of drills and the quality of training becomes much, much more important, decisive, in fact, in terms of explaining and understanding combat performance. Now, the question is then, does this mean that comradeship, friendship, all of that kind of male bonding that Janowitz and Shils weighted with such evidential significance, does that mean that's out the window? Well, quite a few sociologists and social scientists have basically argued yes, that essentially in a professional army, the issue of social cohesion, bonds between homogenous, typically in the past white male, but male is important, soldiers who know each other intimately, are deep soulmates and friends. That's not relevant anymore. We're talking about impersonal professional teams, just like professional sports teams, who are executing procedures. And frankly, their affection for each other, their attraction to each other, affection for each other is entirely irrelevant. And one of the articles that kind of gets towards this is A.L. Ben-Ari's article, which is a really good article, really good book about swift trust and cohesion in the Israeli army. And he argues essentially in the Second Intifada, the IDF essentially had to mix up its groups so much, its platoons and companies so much, that essentially it formed these units that Al Ben-Ari calls tactical bubbles, which consist of totally heterogeneous IDF soldiers who didn't know each other, and yet they were still able to perform extremely well. I mean, the politics of it, whatever, but were able to perform in a tactical sense extremely cohesively. And the argument then is, well, essentially, those deep bonds of male, in particular, solidarity that was so essential to the citizen army are now no longer relevant. That's the argument. Well, look, what I'd like to do just for the last few minutes is just to think through whether that's true. And my essential argument is it's not true. However, neither is it true that the bonds, the primary group bonds in a professional force are the same as those which pertained in a citizen force, 100 years ago, basically in the First World War, in the Second World War, etc. And what it suggests is that what we see is the social, affective, emotional bonds, the friendships between soldiers and Marines in platoons or troops is really important. It's absolutely critical to the unity and the performance of that group in that platoon in contact. But the actual character of the solidarity has changed. And my essential point is it has professionalized. Let me just give you a quick example, just to sort of make this a little bit more concrete. It's an example from a Royal Marine in 2009 who was awarded the Conspicuous Gallantry Cross for an action up in Sangin. 4-5 Commando was deployed into Sangin, and it was obviously, like everyone who's ever in Sangin, it was utterly miserable. And on one of the patrols, this individual, Stephen Nethery, I mean, in my articles, I keep this slightly quieter because I'll tell you a story which is slightly the sort of victim is identifiable from the guy who got the Conspicuous Gallantry Cross. So we can maybe keep this just slightly sort of quieter. But anyway, so what happened was they're out on patrol, and as they returned to the patrol base in Sangin, I think it was, I did actually know this at one point, but I hadn't thought about it. I think it was Combat Outpost Wishton, I think it was. I think that was the one. Anyway, they're returning to their combat outpost, and as they did so, they came under some quite intense fire from Taliban fighters who were located. They'd built some murder holes and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, They did a drill and a baseline drill in response to this contact and withdrew from the fire. And they thought they'd all got safely to the baseline, which was kind of they eventually withdrew to behind a wall about 200 meters or so from where they'd initially got the fire. But then they looked round, and there was one of their comrades was lying on the ground, live, clearly wounded. He was moving, but clearly wounded. Anyway. Nethery ran back through fire, grabbed him, put him, did a fireman's carry and carried him out and under fire, and the rounds were splashing all around his feet and around his head and everything. Anyway, he got a second level, very impressive medal for this action. But what's interesting about it is that the soldier the Marine that he picked up, everyone hated him in the troop. And one would say, well, how do we explain this in terms of traditional cohesion? Everyone's meant to love each other, and they do everything for love. And yet here's Stephen Nethery picking up a Marine who he doesn't like. And here's the thing that's really interesting: he didn't like him because he was a really bad Marine. So he was kind of ostracized in the troop because he was just a really bad Marine. I mean, it happens, doesn't it? And so he was not basically taken seriously by the Marines. His colleagues didn't like him, and yet they saved him. And you can see these two quotes from Stephen Nethery. Now, what the hell's going on here? Why would you bother putting your life at risk to save someone you don't like? And here I'd say the Nethery case starts to elucidate the character of cohesion in a professional army. Not everyone likes each other. It's not entirely about bonds of deep friendship. There are many times when soldiers will execute drills very effectively with colleagues they don't personally get on with, don't know that well, don't particularly like. But here's the thing. What I would suggest to you is in Nethery's comments is that this doesn't mean trust, cohesion, affection, loyalty to each other is unimportant in a professional group, as people like A.L. Ben-Ari, Elizabeth Keir, Robert McCoon assert. I disagree. But what it means is the distribution is different. First of all, what I'd suggest is to be friends, close friends in a professional force, you have to qualify as a good soldier or a good Marine or whatever service you're in. So the criteria of professionalism becomes a sort of gateway into friendship. And what happens in an infantry platoon essentially is that out of that gateway of criteria of actually a trustworthy professional in combat will execute their drills properly and will be a good supporting, tactically acute and aware soldier, that's a gateway towards friendship, and that the professional reference point starts and maintains is a central point in maintaining relations between professional soldiers. And essentially what you see in professionalized infantry platoons is the emergence of what I'd say is a core group, basically a stable body of personnel who've been in the platoon for quite a long time, who represent the sort of professional heart of that group, and whose relationships are incredibly close in terms of friendship and comradeship. But that friendship and comradeship is informed and infused with a professional ethos. Now, what does that mean they can do? Well, one of the things it does mean that they can do is that they can rescue and work with people who they don't actually like. So that there's a level where affection is not relevant, but the affection not being relevant in the case of this Marine who was wounded and then rescued, that works because there is a group that are actually bonded in very tight, affectionate, loyal, personally bonded small groups. Let's go on to the so let's go on to the final slide. I'll just draw this to a little bit of a conclusion. So look, so my conclusion is this. Look, I mean, the problem of small unit combat endures on the battlefields of the 20th and 21st century. The industrial weaponry creates a problem for armies which has to be resolved somehow. Now, what I'm saying is in the 20th century, even though advanced platoon tactics were recognized, generally the performance was based on primary group loyalty. So the cohesiveness of the group motivated the loyalty of soldiers to each other in a personal way, motivated them to fight, even though they weren't that skilled at it. or political motivation was very important. But as we move to the later 20th century and into the 21st, training, preparation, drills becomes the critical cause of combat performance. And that training and drilling produces a different kind of cohesion. The soldiers are as intimately bonded as they were in the 20th century, but they're bonded about their professional skills and their training rather than just their social identity as from the same town, from the same area, being male, being a Nazi, being a white American. The bonding itself comes through and is informed by the actual training and professionalism itself. Now, let me just say about Ukraine. And I'm going to disappoint people here because I think one of the questions was, we're going to talk about Ukraine. I don't know yet. I don't know the answer to this question, but I think it's going to be really interesting. How did cohesion, how has and how will cohesion work in the Ukrainian armed forces? It looks interesting. How has cohesion combat performance not worked in the Russian forces? And what seems to me to be likely is some combination in the Ukrainian case, especially in the newly trained forces, some combination of a bit of training, quite a lot of political motivation, and quite a lot of primary group bonding is has been and will continue to be pretty important. With the Russians, I think there's a massive split. I think their professional force, I think probably their cohesion in certain units, like sort of paratroopers up at Hostomel, was probably quite good. But of course, the Russian forces generally, it looks like their small unit cohesion performance is not effective. That basically there's little motivation, no training, and not much primary group unity either. So those are utterly speculative, but I think this will be a really interesting, when the war's over, which is going to be some time away, I think it'll be a very interesting question to work out where the cohesiveness lay in terms of the Ukrainian forces and the Russian forces. I might say, I don't think this war's been won at that level. I personally think it's been won at the higher level. The operational command's been one of the key things. But I think it will be a very interesting thing to look at, not least, I've got these photos here. It seems that a number of Ukrainian units, female soldiers, have been, in those combat units as they were in the Syrian civil war with the YPG. So I think there's some really interesting questions about cohesion, regular and irregular forces that will come out of Ukraine, which, I will be very interested to have a look at. So thanks for listening. I've gone on 5 more minutes than I meant to, but maybe we could have a chat now.
Okay, thanks, Anthony. Great talk. We have had a couple of questions in the chat. I think I'll just kick off while others collect their thoughts. So you touched on it at the end. Much has been made in some right-wing media about the sort of liberal recruitment ads that certainly the US Army and indeed the British Armed Forces have put out in recent years versus the more masculine and traditional notions of military service that perhaps the Russians have put out. And the military performance in Ukraine doesn't quite own up to those perceived outcomes, i.e. masculine and aggression equals success, and sort of liberal notions of and values equals weakness. So I suppose the missing ingredient there is culture, and also possibly you talked about in another book, in Command. Could you just touch on that, because it wasn't one of your 4 things that you spoke to, and I wonder if that's possibly a missing link.
So in terms of the missing link, what? So in terms of recruiting, sort of liberal values kind of thing.
But I'm trying not to distill this into a binary thing about we should be focusing doubling down on our masculinity and our aggression and our and the sort of the rawness of military service, because in the Russian example, they definitely did go for that, but it hasn't translated into battlefield success. No. Is that largely due to culture? Is it to do with tactical ability?
Yeah, well, I mean, your question, it's it's a very intricate question you've asked, which raises a lot of really interesting points. So why do I think the Russians have failed really badly? I personally, at this point, I don't think it's because of small unit cohesion and a sort of, I mean, look, we know what their small units are like. They've got this system of institutionalized bullying, which means they're really crude force, not capable at the lower level, at small unit level, of complicated maneuvers generally, and where institutionalized bullying is the system of command. So that's not, it's not, the problem there is it's not very professional. It's just a sort of, I mean, it actually echoes the Japanese army of the Second World War. I mean, that's what the Japanese army of the Second World War was based on as well. Massive bullying, incredible brutality, and people would fight and die for each other. But actually, the tactical performances were often, questionable in terms of So what I'd suggest is, that the way the Russians recruit and train definitely gives a certain, sort of, I mean, we would look upon it as a kind of deviant form of professional culture based, I mean, it's, sort of like closer to something like the Foreign Legion, French Foreign Legion or something. And it produces a kind of tactical performance of some type. I mean, people fight and are willing to fight and they're willing to fight for each other, but it has a crudity. But what I'd suggest is, with the Russians, I think the failures have been at command level. I mean, they still aren't they're still incapable of operational command, and certainly operational command of any sophistication. So the failure for me, although I think there is a correlation between the cohesion at the lowest level and some of the brutality we've seen. So some of the massacres, for instance, in Bucha, Irpin, and other places, I think they can start to be correlated with the culture of the small unit in the Russian army, based on this hideous sort of bullying system. The failure for me is at a higher level of command, at the command level. That's what's been there now. But your question, you see, in terms of the adverts in Britain, these sort of kind of weird. I mean, I some of them I find really odd. So here's the thing, so we want a military that is, I think most of us want a military that's, inclusive, that's reasonable in its orientation, that its personnel are treated sensibly, that diverse personnel are all treated well. And that's all great. But at the small unit, and obviously what interests me as a small unit infantry unit is the fight is still the same. I mean, look at Bakhmut. It's not very different from Stalingrad. I mean, there's certain things at the operational level I say are quite different. But in terms of if you're a squad in Bakhmut, I mean, Allied soldiers fighting in Ortona or Aachen, or German soldiers fighting in Stalingrad, it's not that different. So there is an odd thing going on where the advertising, and obviously Carter was in charge of some of those advertising about these odd ones about snowflakes and things. It's like, you don't want psychopaths, though they have their uses at a certain point. But you don't want psychopaths. But recruiting on a basis that somehow war has become a technical thing, and what you need is people who are really good with data. I mean, that is true. You do need those people, but you don't need those people in your infantry platoons. In the infantry platoons, you need tough people. Now, those tough people can be women or men. That's fine. No, and that seems to be where where Western armies need to get to, where if that person is capable of executing those drills and enduring the hideousness of being in the infantry, they should be there. But as I say, there is a dissonance with the sort of, I mean, those adverts that I've seen, and I'm not sure they're particularly helpful, I've got to say. I mean, that's a bit of a rambling answer, but I mean, in terms of Russia, I don't think it explains their failure, but it explains some of their atrocities would be my short answer.
Okay, great. Thomas Hale, could you unmute, please, and ask your question? One of the three that you've got.
Well, that's seeing whether my microphone works or not.
I can hear you.
Oh, fantastic. Thank you very much, sir. I'm going to preamble this by saying thank you very much. And I have your book on urban warfare and find it fascinating. I just thought I'd throw that into the mix.
Oh, well, thank you for that.
I'm going to be greedy and ask 2 out of 3. This question, this entire presentation, which has been excellent, seems very infantry heavy, at least in terms of the examples that you've gone through. Could you comment on other arms and the impact of cohesion on other arms and other services in the battle space?
Great. Well, Thomas, thanks for that. Yeah, totally. So my short answer is to this. It's a completely valid question, but I focused on the platoon, the infantry platoon. And the reason was this: I wanted to have something that was the simplest military action and was also essentially completely historically and cross-culturally comparable. So British soldiers or German soldiers in the First World War are basically doing this from 1916, are basically trying to do the same thing as professional soldiers in the Ganjgal in 2007. So I focused absolutely and exclusively on the infantry platoon as the unit and the platoon attack essentially as the kind of action. Now, I do, so all of my research base, all of that book is absolutely about, and in the sense it's methodologically, unashamedly about the infantry platoon. Do I think it has bearing on the other arms and services? Completely. I think that what I'd suggest is, and this is more anecdotal from my interactions with the army subsequent to the Cohesion book, when I did the stuff on command and urban, etc., that I think the kind of move that I suggest has happened in the infantry platoon, I think is reflected in those other corps and services, and the way they execute their performances, their functions, has shifted as well. Do I have absolutely corroborated evidence of that? No, because I didn't do the research on it. But what I would say is that I think the kind of professional ethos that I really emphasize in this talk and emphasize in the book, I think that is absolutely consistent across all the corps and services. Yeah, I mean, so I think there's a sort of a compatibility, but I regret to say I did not do systematic studies of other corps and services, even though they are completely equally as valid and as equally interesting in my view.
Thank you for that. Appreciate that, sir.
It's a pleasure.
Could I therefore be very greedy and indulge the audience by asking, so what's the impact of doctrine on cohesion specifically? Because I'm not expecting everybody to break open one, but seriously, in terms of you're saying that training and discipline are very core components. So where does doctrine fit into that mix? Thank you.
Well, it depends what you call doctrine. I mean, I sort of use doctrine in terms of infantry platoon. I've used the sort of training pamphlets. I've just called that doctrine. It's completely essential. It's really important. So that there's a series of really famous publications, 1916 and then 1917, Platoon in Attack, etc., produced by Britain. And the initial publications of this stuff was French, actually. It was published. The French developed it first. They're really important because without those those manuals are basically hard-learned lessons learned in combat. They're sort of the memories of kind of dead soldiers, essentially, distilled into print. And so I'd say, actually, doctrine is really, I mean, I know that in the British Army, people always joke about doctrine. Some of the doctrine produced, I think, is hopelessly woolly. But those kind of infantry manuals, completely essential. How would you know how to do an infantry attack unless you had a manual? Well, you'd only know it by experience, but the experience would kill half or more your platoon, so you'd never know. So for me, the written pamphlets are really important artifacts, and I think some of the doctrine that you see now is sort of more abstruse, higher level strategic doctrine. I'm not sure. I mean, I think you could probably survive quite happily without that. I mean, most people don't read it anyway, so that would be evidence it doesn't make any difference, but not at the lower level. You know, the sort of, you have this green, was it the TAM, isn't it? The tactical aim memoir. I think a lot of what the British Army does would be impossible without that. You know, the coordination, etc. So for me, really important. I think it's really important. And that's not to say people don't develop and try new things, but certainly as a basic guideline of what you're going to do, I think the manuals and the doctrine is really, really important. Yeah, that I would say. It might be an unfashionable view, but I think it's really important.
Okay, thanks. Des, do you mind asking your question? You've got your hand up, so I assume you have a question.
Yeah, sure. Sorry. I'll put my face on the screen as well, just to scare people.
You're right.
You're
Good
right.
to see you. Good to see you, mate.
Yeah, exactly. Just going back to Slam Marshall and his observation of mass conscript armies. I was just wondering if shooting is the wrong metric, because if you look, as I do, at sort of 1944 and 1950s infantry pamphlets, actually it shows the infantry when they're moving forward actually carrying the rifles at the trail, and it's all about, to be honest, artillery defeating the enemy and then the infantry moving forward to seize and hold ground. And I was interested in your thought, because you've obviously focused in on the professional platoon, which is obviously doing lots of shooting and firing and etc. Whereas I wonder now, is arguably Ukraine would probably more back to that mass conscript approach, that actually it is about firepower in terms of artillery and other rocket systems, and the infantry job literally is just to endure and hold ground in holes.
Yeah. So Des, thanks for this. So yeah, I mean, look, without getting on to a really boring rant about Marshall and the technicalities, yeah, I mean, this is a point that many of his critics point to, that it's a way too crude a metric to judge infantry performance by, that, you know, some infantry could be crawling forward and inconveniencing and all that. But I mean, actually, in the cases, he had two cases really that he developed the theory from. One was 50. It might have been the 506. I mean, I to be honest, I didn't get a chance to look at my book, so some of the evidence is I can't remember. It's basically, it's something like the 506 or 502nd. No, it's not 506 because that's Band of Brothers. It's 502nd, and in Normandy. And another one is from the 26th Infantry Regiment on the Mackinac Islands. These are where he got the idea from. And both actions are really interesting in that there was genuine non-firing in situations where you would expect firing. So in the Mackin's really interesting case, because a two-company group got attacked by the Japanese at night in a defensive position, and you think, right, bloody hell, mate, I'll fire, I'm going to get bayoneted. Nah, only the machine gunners fired. It was really interesting. Anyway, so it is definitely a crude metric. You know, and loads of critics rounded on him about it. I would say the criticism in a different way, that what he exaggerated also is that in certain circumstances, not very good infantry would not fire, but there's other circumstances in which they fire way too much. So there's various incidents which he well knew about where there'd been a kind of forward panic and a platoon had gone, or company had gone completely crazy and were firing all over the damn place and shooting. So it is when really dissected, bit too crude. But when you look at the examples he derived it from, although, you know, and this is the other thing about Marshall, let me say, he's a complete self-promotionalist. So he was really pleased with himself for getting the firing thing, because it's such a brilliant headline, isn't it? Rather than saying, oh, sometimes inertia sets in a citizen army, saying, oh, well, only 1 in 4 fires their weapon. You know what I mean? As a policy-orientated person, one is pretty weak, the other is pretty strong. So, but in the circumstances that he derived them from, there's two, as I say, the sort of focusing in on the non-firing is actually a symbol and a symptom of a general lethargy and inactivity on the part of the troops, when they're not, it's not that they're doing what they should be told, you know, trailing their weapons forward and doing and attacking. They've gone to ground and they're not doing anything. And the one in it's I think it's the 502, because it's Robert, whatever his name is, who got a Congressional Medal of Honor, was subsequently killed on Market Garden. But I mean, this Marshall, the story is, I mean, it's totally corroborated in official history. The lieutenant colonel was running along the line, kicking his soldiers, and he couldn't get them to do anything. Couldn't get them, and they were paratroopers, couldn't get them to do a damn thing. They wouldn't do anything. What I'd say is, yeah, your points are really well made. But it's not, I think that Marshall could be in that way could be defended. What I'd say is it is too crude a metric, and there were loads of times when the firing rate wasn't 1 in 4, and he totally exaggerated it for effect. But his fundamental point, I think, does stand about the problem of inertia. Now, what I'd also say is, totally agree with you. What's interesting, isn't it, is how important, funny old thing, how important artillery is, again, in high intensity peer warfare. But even then, I'd say, and I'm really, I'd say it'll be interesting to see what comes out of Ukraine. But even then, that last 200 meters, an infantry platoon that's able to clear a complicated position is still important. That not everything gets reduced by artillery in the close battle. So I would still say, yeah, certainly the 9/11 wars, infantry took on and over elaborate drills, especially in the urban, took on a position that probably was not quite right. I still think that skilled infantry is important, even in a theatre like Ukraine, even though you can't do anything without the artillery. I agree. So that's not very, but you can see what I'm saying about Marshall. You put your finger on something that his critics really went to town on. Absolutely, from the 70s. It started with Hackworth, and then it was just like a free fire zone on Marshall. And for about 10 years, he was totally rejected. People just, I think wrongly, totally dismissed his work for the reasons you're saying. It was too crude a metric. But thanks for that, Des. It's good. It's a really good point,
Thanks very much. Cheers.
Daniel Fox, please.
Hi. Can you hear me?
Yeah, got you.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, I just wanted to go back slightly. You on the topic of recruitment ads and recruiting from a more diverse recruiting base and that topic. I think I've potentially a fairly unique view on it. So I served with the 1st Battalion of the Royal Irish Regiment, who, for those who haven't worked with the Rangers before, is 80% from the island of Ireland, both north and south.
Yeah.
So I'm sure you can imagine it's a very interesting thing to walk into a barrack room and have a tricolour over one bed and a red hand of Ulster over the other bed.
For sure.
But have you done any looking into, and I suppose it's going to become more of an issue as countries become less homogenous in the world we live in, of units like the Royal Irish, where you have people who have arguably fundamental differences who are working together. And I can say from personal experience that anyone in the Royal Irish would do anything for anyone else, even if they don't like them personally, as your Marine example did, because that's what you do.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious to hear your thoughts on kind of units like that.
This is a really great question. So in terms of the Royal Irish, funny old thing. So one of my PhD students, Patrick Bury, served in the Royal Irish in 2000, between 2004 and 2010, and actually was fought out in Helmand on the 2008 deployment. And we wrote an article together on exactly this question. I mean, this now sounds hideously self-promotional, but in that book Frontline, which is stupidly priced, and I wouldn't recommend you buying it, we have a chapter on the Royal Irish in Sangin, and the issue. Basically, the article talks about the sort of, a corporal had professed his love after a total cock-up. A corporal under Patrick Bury professed his love for Patrick Bury, and what we dissected in the article was actually what sounded like a sort of 20th century masculine bonding thing was actually a professional covenant between two professional soldiers. That's what it's actually being. And so what it suggests, the Royal Irish are an interesting case. And I would say, oh yeah, one of the interesting things there is the sort of professionalism of the organization, is so it's so powerful. The training professionalism is such a powerful socializing mechanism that political affiliations, inevitable political affiliations, are subordinated to an organizational regimental affiliation. Now, what I would say is also, in terms of the British Army, this is becoming ever more important because the British Army is becoming an increasingly diverse place. 10% female, 10-12% Black, Asian, ethnic minority. But of that 10% ethnic minority, about 5, 6, 7%, the figures are unclear, is actually Commonwealth. So they're actually not even from the UK. So at this point, you've got really quite an intense problem, and which seems to me the only plausible way of solving it is through really rigorous professionalized training. Now, this comes back to the adverts and actually to the work I did on the audit last year, which is one of the things where it's quite come from, whether it's a resourcing issue, but one of the things that's slightly concerning in a deeply, in a diversifying military force, my point would be, you need really strong training and professional ethos to unify people like in the Royal Irish, who potentially have not much or nothing in common. And one of the things I'd note about the British Army, the training standards, the exercising quality, training quality has gone down really a lot since Afghanistan. I mean, this is not me speaking. This is loads of soldiers I was lucky enough to speak to. And therefore, in a highly heterogeneous force, I actually think that's quite dangerous. I warned CGS about it quite strongly, actually. But I think, but I think your experiences in Royal Irish, I recognise and would affirm, and that for me would affirm the importance of training, because what are you going to, where is the social bonding going to happen when people are from completely different countries? So yeah, it's a really good point, and so I totally agree. The Royal Irish are a good example, an interesting example.
Great, thanks, Nev. Nev, if you're on, please unmute.
Good evening. Good evening, Anthony. Nice to see you.
Hi there.
Hi. I've got a question, really. The one sort of element I don't think that's really been brought out much here is the impact of the enemy and their impact on cohesiveness of the force. My initial thoughts are very contemporary. Is obviously one thing that's really improving the cohesiveness of the Ukrainian army is the fact that Russia has invaded their homeland, as I'm sure it had an impact on the Nazi forces, at the end of the Second World War. So, and clearly, my personal experience, I noted, and we've all noted, a sort of step change in the British army when there has been operations and there is an enemy, and you see that even in the playground. Everybody likes to have an enemy or someone they don't like, if you like, and that can cohere in gangs and groups all around the world. So to what extent would you give that? And I'm sorry, my audio wasn't entirely reliable during the chat, so you may have mentioned it and I missed it. So
no, I
apologize.
I didn't, and it's a very good point. So I mean, my own take on this, I totally agree with you. The enemy is important, and I think the enemy is important in two ways, and I think the two ways generally filter in, and I would incorporate them into political motivation and into small unit cohesion. So how does the enemy filter in? Well, you gave the great example. Yeah, because if an enemy invades your country and kills and rapes your own citizens, you're likely to be quite motivated to kill them back, etc. So so that kind of the sort of the enmity based on political differences, I think, is a major factor. And even in a professional force, I think, I didn't mention it here at all, but I think in Afghanistan and Iraq, it was not as pronounced as in other places. Though it was much more pronounced in the U.S. forces than in the in other Western allied NATO forces. But yeah, so the enemy as a is a political motivator. The other thing I'd say is the enemy becomes a motivator in a second way, at a more visceral level. I think works really well and has been documented by various people. Alexander Watson, the military historian, has put this argument forward very well. Basically, obviously the enemy kills your friends in the small unit. And so the small unit becomes vengeful for the death of its comrades. And that is an absolutely major motivating factor in how well a force can fight. And so, so for me, I mean, it's really good you mentioned this. I would incorporate those enemy effects in those two elements: political motivation at the higher level, i.e. Ukraine want to boot people out, and then the small unit cohesion. It's not just you killed some people who are citizens of my country, you just killed my best mate, right? I'm going to do, and I think that, I think that is hugely significant in terms of generating higher levels of combat performance completely. How are we doing?
Yeah, we're still doing good. So Bessir, please, next question.
Thank you, Professor King. My question is on basically Russian soldiers' combat effectiveness. Both Putin and the Russian forces were expecting to reach to an El Dorado, and Stalin post-World War II borrowed the entire Hitler's playbook, tens of thousands of rivals getting killed, and also setting up of the gulags and what have you. So when you think of the Russian soldiers that have been killed at this time, do you think in any way he would be creating a new generation, completely differently indoctrinated soldiers, or do you think they would just continue on motivating their soldiers through poverty? Over. Thank you.
Oh, it's a good question. I mean, I've got to say, I'm not qualified to answer that question. I'll tell you what's happening. Dara McKissack is just about to publish a RAND report on the Russian military performance in Ukraine. I was lucky enough to I heard her speak at a conference kind of about a week ago or so. And I mean, she would be, if anyone could answer that question, it would be her. I say I just don't know. I mean, who knows what the hell's going to happen? Is there, is it going to be, say, after this war is over? What I still think it's got 24 months to run at least, and if if it stays at the level of escalation that we've got, so i.e. within bounds. Who knows? I mean, the only thing is, one of the things that this report shows is, and we know this already. I mean, the levels of attrition on the best bits of the Russian forces, airborne forces, Spetsnaz. I mean, if the figures that RAND have got are remotely correct, which I'm sure they are remotely correct, I mean, they've basically had their whole professional cadre eliminated, either killed or wounded in Ukraine. So, I mean, how to rebuild a force from that is, I mean, and I don't think, I'm not in the camp that, the Russians have been killed, been defeated there, we don't have to worry about them for a generation. I don't see that that's. I think the key thing is the politics of it. If the Russian state still wants to be aggressive, it might well be able to recover. But how they will do it is, because their professional cadre has been decimated, it's definitely an issue. I mean, so your kind of thesis that, well, maybe they'll just go for some fanatical political motivation, kind of like, a bit Hezbollah-ish, Hamas-ish, Iranian Republican Guard. I mean, maybe, which actually some bits of it are highly sophisticated. Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting thesis. I just don't know the answer. As I say, I think the nearest anyone would know is Dara McKissack at RAND. I think she'd be the one who'd be best to answer that. But it's a really important question. Thanks.
If I may just follow up on that.
Sure.
My primary indicator was Belarusian complaining about Russian soldiers stealing and
Was it?
getting
Oh,
drunk and
interesting.
fighting before.
They were totally undisciplined in Belarus.
Indeed, yes. And I've actually shared it with a celebratory note on my LinkedIn. I mean, that's where the success is, something to cheer about, but something to worry about, I would say, the Russian citizens established overseas, 20 years, 30 years, kind of like a sleeper cell theory. Over.
Yeah. No, I mean, it's the repercussions of this war are going to be very, very profound, and it's not going to be business as usual afterwards. That's for sure. I am of the school of this. This is a fundamental transformation of European defense architecture, and what Russia is going to look like is going to be interesting and probably quite dangerous.
Thank you very much, Professor.
Yeah, cheers. It's really good to speak.
John, please.
Hiya. Hope you can hear me.
Got you. Yeah.
Great. I think I've become somewhat skeptical listening to this. That combat cohesion actually adds much to our levels of understanding at all, because troops who evidently have very, very high levels of cohesion just seems to be just as much as of a way of taking inordinate losses, trying to do the impossible things against the conditions, as opposed to just being highly trained and effective. And kind of related to that, I can't help slightly seeing a kind of class-based point in terms of Marshall's reasoning, in that the problem is essentially lower middle class soldiers not being keen enough to do incredibly risky things compared to their aristocratic or upper middle class officers. Can you see?
So John,
sorry.
Yeah. So just let me come. So you're just so I've just understood the first question. What you're saying is, in a military sense. So I mean, I've got to say, a lot of my interests in this are purely sociological. I just like studying small groups because they're kind of interesting, and a platoon is a pretty interesting group. But your point is, in terms of operationally, the small unit is not that important. Is that what you're saying? Is that what you're?
I hope I'm saying something slightly different to that, which is that what we're saying in terms of combat cohesion, in whichever form that we generate it, then I think it's undeniable from your own examples that some armies who've developed incredible amounts of cohesion at the infantry platoon level. So you've mentioned Soviets, you've mentioned Japanese.
Yeah.
The factors you've put together, although you didn't draw this conclusion necessarily, would apply to some elements of the Taliban. We can see it on video in terms of like Wagner troops in Ukraine.
Yeah.
The actual levels of combat cohesion are pretty much off the charts.
Yeah.
But that's what the army that tries that achieves is getting large numbers of its infantry to do incredibly risky things.
Yeah.
Which just leads to massive casualties. It doesn't correlate with success. Because
it's a very interesting point. I mean, it's a really interesting point. Especially in high intensity warfare, that it's a really interesting point that if you wait too much on the infantry, you just get them killed. It's a very interesting point. I mean, can I immediately think of corroborating evidence? It is an extremely interesting point. I think there probably is. I think there is some historical evidence of potentially that. But this then leads to the question of. I mean, this is why, in a way, I then did the book on. Sorry, this sounds a bit self-promotion, but that's one of the reasons why I then did the book on divisional command, because course, you know, I see the whole thing as linked up, you know, and especially in professional force, that, lower level cohesion is only effective insofar as you have organizational cohesion at whatever you want to call it, the high tactical, grand tactical, or operational level, that the two things need to be together. And it comes back to Des's point is, yeah, brilliant, great, but actually against a high intensity opponent, you want to have your artillery working, and if you don't have that coordination, which is based at divisional, typically based at divisional level, you however good your infantry are, they'll just be massacred. So yeah, I think it's what you're saying is you know, that it's having good infantry is necessary but not sufficient for operational effect, and that's actually an interesting thing to explore, that having good infantry without anything else just means that you expend your infantry more than untrained people who just won't fight for you. I mean, it's a very interesting thought. In terms of the class thing, it's a really interesting observation. I don't think it works. I mean, my own take on this, it doesn't work. It doesn't work for, you know, Marshall. I don't think there is a classist element to Marshall, and a couple of reasons. That Marshall doesn't. He actually has loads of cases where an individual did all the work, but he doesn't draw the implication out quite as much as someone like myself as a sociologist does. So he says, oh, you've got your firers, you know, he talks about the firers in combat, these sort of leading people, and he certainly doesn't note that there's a correlation between their rank and their activity, whereas that's an argument that I make, that actually what's quite interesting on the sample that I looked at is it's not very often a private soldier who does the heroic charge. Sometimes it is, but most often it's someone holding rank, be they NCO or an officer, a junior officer. So he doesn't notice that, and I don't think, you know, and in the American Army also, the class-based thing wouldn't work quite so. So I mean, there's lots wrong with Marshall, but I think, although, you know, it's a pretty subtle observation, noticing the potential class divide, I think that would be a pretty harsh reading of his prose, to be honest, personally. I don't think, I wouldn't read it like that personally. Though if someone pointed out the text where it's there, I'm stand corrected. You know what I mean? I would stand corrected completely. Yeah, and I think Marshall himself was from quite a modest background. I think he was a kind of good old kind of, you know, American Republican with a small R, you know. So I don't see its class, but I'm not saying it's not. I mean, maybe it is in some passages.
I think that's me. I think my language there was clumsy because it gets us thinking about like normal political class-based things. What the class distinction I'm making here is between officer and senior NCO class. And private soldiers, although that especially in some militaries may well map quite closely onto that. But I think Marshall does make the argument that it's officer supervision which makes these things happen.
Yeah,
to an extent, it's that relationship between specified leadership and subordinates.
Yeah, I mean, there's a bit of that, and also an emphasis on horizontal communication between soldiers. So he's got that passage where he says, you know, the best thing that could happen in combat is, you know, one soldier should tap his colleague on the shoulder, and that communication will provide a bonding element. So, you know, I mean, I'm absolutely intrigued by your interpretation, and yeah, it's you know, it's interesting. And what I would say is, certainly in the British Army, one of the things that's absolutely definite, because I've done some work on this recently, what is interesting is the recognition of gallant actions in combat in the 20th century, in the First, Second World War career, is ridiculously class-based. So junior officers way overrepresented in gallantry medals, and some of that, you can explain by the situational factors that I've described, but I think also some of it is, I think some of it is classist as well. So, I think there is some evidence in places for the kinds of things that you describe. I mean, as I say, the US Army, British Army, especially in the Second World War, pretty different entities, so one would have to sort of correlate the two things quite carefully. But I mean, I'm interested by what you're saying. Interesting. And how that fits in with a professional force, where it's not that class has disappeared in any way, but where class certainly gets reconfigured. It is interesting. It's a great question. Thanks.
Okay, that's pretty much out of time. I don't think there's anything left in the questions, but please do take this to Twitter or to the website if you do want to continue it. It just leaves me to say, Anthony, thank you very much for your time this evening. It's been a very illuminating discussion, and I think the questions have also taken us to a point that maybe we didn't think we were going to get to when we first started. So all for the better, and perhaps we can get you on again to talk about command or urban in the not too distant future.
Oh, it would be a total pleasure. I mean, it's been lovely to see, and it's lovely to see some old friends, and yeah, it's really nice to everyone to have a chat with everyone, and yeah, anytime. Yeah, I'm happy with that. But thanks so much for having me. It's been lovely.
Just a shout out for those on the call, the Defence Simulation Education and Training event in Bristol this year, 5th to 8th of June. There will be a Fight Club representation, so if you do want to get yourself down there and you are fortunate enough to be able to waive the entry fee, then please do so. You can sign up by searching DSET online and doing so there. That's all for tonight. Thank you, everyone. Hope you have the rest of a good evening.
See you later.
Thanks, Anthony. Thank you. Thanks, Ed.
Yeah, look after yourselves.